U-Save. And here, I got a picture of it. It's kind of a pixelated picture, but this was where I worked this was my first job in Okeechobee, Florida, at U-Save. But you know what? We had another name for it, me and my friends. We called it U-Slave, okay? We always called it U-Slave. And I've been fortunate. I've only had 3 jobs in my life, all right? One was at U-Save, I'll say it the nice way, and then it was at Okeechobee Christian Church in here. So I've only had 3 jobs my entire life, and this was one of them. And looking at this picture brings back a lot of good and maybe not so good memories too. But one of the things that when I was there, I started off as a bag boy, and then I was promoted to cashier, and then I worked in the office, and I counted all the people's money. On Saturday nights, we would close out for the week. We would count hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was so exhilarating counting other people's money. I'll tell you, it was a lot of fun. But across the street from U-Save was a place that maybe some of you like to frequent up here near the interstate. There was an Arby's restaurant, okay? And so a lot of times on our lunch breaks, we would go across the street to Arby's, and so I would do that pretty often. And so I got in I was gonna find a picture of it, but I thought I won't give you another picture. But I got in my little red Ford Escort, okay, and I drove across the street to get my Arby's sandwich, okay. So I pull through the drive-through and I give them my order. Now you have to understand this Arby's, the Arby's in Okeechobee, it was known for being really slow. I mean, it was real. I mean, you get a milkshake and you're sitting there for like 10 minutes, all right? 10 or 15 minutes for a milkshake. So here I'm asking for a meal, right? So I make the order and I pull up to the window and I'm waiting and I'm waiting and I'm waiting, all right? And it was probably 5 to 10 minutes that I waited, and I got tired of my foot being on the brake. So I put the car in park, and so I waited and I waited and I waited, and eventually they came and they brought my food to me. And of course I'm thinking, all right, great. Well, by that time, half of my break was up, okay? So I'm like wanting to hurry up and get back to the store so that I can go to the break room and eat my food real quick before I have to go back. So when I get the food, I think, okay, it's in park, you know, so then I don't even pay attention. I move the shit, I shift it, think I'm putting it back into drive, all right? So I shift it back, and I hit the gas, and I go backwards, all right? And wouldn't you know, it would be one of the unfortunate times when somebody was there too. Yeah, and so I hit the gas in reverse and run into a lady behind me. All right, so I remember I ran into her from in behind, and I remember looking at my rearview mirror and seeing this look on her face, like, what just happened? And I'm sure if there was something on my face, I'm sure I had the same look. What just happened? And so and of course I don't want to knock on wood here. That's the only crash I've ever caused in my life. All right, was that one? All right. But she had this what just happened looked on her face, and so when the police came, because we had to, of course, report it, he come. There wasn't very much damage, but the funniest thing is it took him a few minutes to figure out. He's like, what just happened? I think he couldn't quite figure out how in the world do you run into somebody behind you, in the drive-through, but I did, and we all had this what just happened look. I bet for many of you, you've probably had that what just happened look in your life many times too. I bet you've had that what just happened look when it was after a marriage that seemed like things were going so well and it just falls apart. Or maybe you have a child that you've invested so much in your life in, you've put so much into, only to see them make bad decisions, and you think, what just happened? Or maybe your finances have been in good shape and then something happens. Someone loses a job, they lose their health, or maybe there's a bad investment, and you think to yourself, what just happened? Well, as we come into Jeremiah chapter 2 today, that's what we'll be today, is in Jeremiah chapter 2. I think many of the people that were in Israel kind of had that what just happened look. I mean, for so long, they thought that things were just fine, even though they were practicing their idolatry. But the fact of the matter was that cracks had been forming in their country. They had lost God's blessing, and now the country was in shambles. And really, they shouldn't have had that what just happened look. They really shouldn't. There was all of these prophets that came and warned them. who came and told them what would happen if they continued in their idolatry, but they didn't listen. They shouldn't have been surprised. Now, just to give you a quick recap, we'll bring up here on the screen, all right? Just to give you a quick recap, you might see here that we have a map on the screen, and we have these two kingdoms. If you remember, at one time, Israel and Judah were one. It was one nation under Saul, under David and Solomon. But after Solomon, we had a split, right? We had Rehoboam, who became king of the south. We had Jeroboam, who became the king of the north. And these two kingdoms split. And this went on for many years. And there were 38 different kings. Only 5 of them were good. The other 33 were bad. And none of them were good in the north. And all 5 of the good ones were in the south. And if you remember last week, we talked about how the Assyrians came south and attacked the northern kingdom, or Israel. They came through, they went right through it. Samaria was the capital. They went right through it, and they took over the nation. Of course, they continued their pursuit into the south in Judah, thinking, hey, we can take these people out. We've taken everybody else out. But if you remember, there was an X factor. Do you remember who that was? It was King Hezekiah, right? King Hezekiah was the X factor. And he had a great faith in God, and he prayed to God, and God sent an angel overnight while all these soldiers were encamped around Jerusalem, and he killed 185,000 of them. It's a pretty amazing story. And so the king of the Assyrians, went back to the north, kind of with his tail between his legs, right? And that was pretty much the end of the trouble from the Assyrians, because Hezekiah, as long as his reign continued, the nation continued to be blessed. It was saved. It didn't have any more problems. But during this entire period, though, the problem was that there was still idolatry. Idolatry came back. Hezekiah's son Manasseh didn't love the Lord like Hezekiah did. And so idolatry came back, and God would continue to send prophets to warn them, to say, you know what, look at what happened to your family members to the north. This can happen to you in the south. They just kept warning them. And so what we see, though, is that God eventually does allow, that's what we see in the chapter this week, in chapter 17, God eventually allows Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians, to lay siege to Jerusalem. Now, most of us think of the siege in 586, when the actual walls were torn down, when the temple was destroyed, but we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves for what I'm going to talk about today, because actually Nebuchadnezzar came down and he took the city itself in 597. Okay, so he didn't destroy it at first, because what he did was he took the city and he left a vassal kings, and they were kings that were continuing the line after Hezekiah, but they were under the authority of the Babylonian king, who in this case was Nebuchadnezzar. So in 597, he leaves a vassal king of Judah. And during this period, we read that a lot of the people of Judah were taken captive, and they were taken back to Babylon, but there were some who stayed behind. And so that's where we find Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet who preached to the remnant who were still there. Now you would think, after seeing what happened to their neighbors to the north, and now what had happened to them now that they were underneath the authority of the Babylonians, many of us would probably think, oh, now they'll get it, right? They'll figure it out. They see what happened. They realize their mistake. But they don't. Their hearts are hardened. And so God, what does he do? He tells Jeremiah to preach to them. He challenges them. He tells Jeremiah to challenge them. And so we see this verse here that pops up here in Jeremiah 2. God tells Jeremiah, this is what the Almighty, the Lord God Almighty, the God of Israel says. Listen, I'm going to bring on the city and all the villages around it every disaster I pronounced against them, because they were stiff-necked and would not listen to my words. So he's telling them, he's saying, Jeremiah, I want you to preach. You know what? They're not going to listen. They're hard-hearted. They're stiff-necked. They're not going to accept what you have to say. Boy, that's a real great thing to hear, right? I mean, you're given a mission, but you're pretty much told you're going to fail. But you know what? Jeremiah is a man of faith. And you know what? I think even in connection with his faith, he is a man that loves his nation. He doesn't give up on it. He doesn't want to give up on it. But here's the other thing about Jeremiah you have to realize, and this is one of the reasons I think I love Jeremiah. Jeremiah was not a fire and brimstone type of preacher, all right? Now, a lot of times when we think of a prophet, we think of someone who's talking about the future. I talked about this a few weeks ago. But really, prophets not only would prophesy the future, but they preached. That was their role, okay? That was pretty much their primary role. And so when he preached, he didn't do it with fire and brimstone. He did it with this different type of attitude. As you read through the book, you can kind of see it. Oftentimes, Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet. He was a man who wept for his country, who had this deep emotional attachment to his country and his desire for them to turn back to God. And so often he would plead with them through his tears because he knew what would come if they didn't listen. And so again, when we remember last week, we remember that Hezekiah was blessed. Hezekiah was blessed because of his emphasis on prayer and purity. And so here we see in chapter 2, we're going to read verses 9 to 13 here to start. The message, though, here we see is the opposite of what happened back with Hezekiah. See, the message was that God would protect the nation. Now we see something different. We're going to see what happens when God brings judgment. It says this. It says, "Therefore I bring these charges against you again, declares the Lord." Notice the word there, again. Do you see it? I'm bringing this charge again. This isn't the first time, okay? We've been down this road before. God goes on to say, "I will bring these charges against your children's children." He says, "Cross over to the coast of Cyprus and look, send to Kedar and observe closely. See if there has ever been anything like this. Has a nation ever changed its gods?" And they're not really gods at all, right? I mean, other nations don't change their gods, it says, and they're not even real. But look what it says here. But my people have exchanged their God, their glory, for worthless idols. Be appalled at this, O heavens, and shudder with great horror, declares the Lord. And then he says this, "My people, they have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." You know, God encapsulates here in these verses all of their sin and their rebellion and their idolatry. But what he is getting at is this, and we'll bring it up here. What he is getting at is this, is that idolatry is not just one of many sins, it is the sin that all sins fall under. See, I think we tend to think of idolatry as being a singular sin, but really when it comes down to it, all sin in our life is a result of some layer, some amount of idolatry that's present. And for some of you here, you might not quite be following what I'm getting at. You're reading this and you're like, okay, but because it challenges the thinking we've had maybe for so many years, that we think it's just one of many sins. You might think this, you might think, you know what, I don't have a problem with idolatry, but you know what, I lust after another person that doesn't belong to me in marriage. See, that's the problem, is you are choosing to worship sexual pleasure over God. You see that? There's idolatry. Or you might think to yourself, I don't have a problem with idolatry, but I get really jealous of what other people have. Well, then you have a god of materialism over you. You see that? Or you might think, I don't have a problem with idolatry, but I really worry a lot. See? Then you've made comfort and security your god. You see what I'm getting at here? Is that it all comes back to idolatry. See, Jeremiah here is trying to tell them, he's trying to say, God's problem with you can be described with you in this one sin. And it's idolatry. It's all these worthless gods. And he uses a metaphor here to help the people understand what he's talking about. He talks about cisterns that don't hold water. He talks about how the cisterns represent a false god. They're looking for something other than God to be their satisfaction, to quench their thirst. And is that what you're doing? I mean, are you trying to fill a cistern, trying to find joy in that, but it's cracked and it's letting out holes, and you will never quench your thirst? I'm going to throw up a picture here of what a cistern looks like. Here's a cistern for you. Pretty much a cistern was usually a hole that was dug in the ground where rainwater would be stored. It was a little bit different than a well, okay? A well would have water that was continually coming into it. A cistern wasn't that way at all. The water, they would often channel it, and it would go down into the cistern, okay? And so you can just imagine all the water in there. You got to remember, they didn't have water treatment plants or water softeners or purifiers, right? They didn't have all that back then. So you can imagine the water going in there. It wasn't always the most pleasant to drink, right? But that was how they had to do it. And And you have to remember, too, in Judah and in that period, well, even now today, I should say, it's a very dry place 6 months out of the year. So they had to store the water or else they wouldn't have anything to drink. And whenever a cistern sprung a leak, they were really hard to fix because they were in the ground. It was often hard to find out exactly where the leak was. It was just a really sad way of trying to hold your water, but you had to do it. And the thing is that often whenever a cistern would go bad, rather than just trying to fix it, they would just go out and dig them another one. They would just have to dig another one and another one and another one. It's very interesting in the archaeological digs over in Israel that how many of these cisterns they found. There were a lot of them. And so what they were trying to do is they were trying to find living water from water. What God was trying to compare it was to a cistern, where the water just sits and it becomes stagnant and it leaks. God wants them to know, what He's trying to tell them is He wants them to know that He is the living water. He's not the stagnant stuff that's leaking from a cistern. But instead of the living water, instead of God Himself, they go after the same stagnant false gods that they have been going after for many, many years. And here's the thing. They might find some hydration for a while, but it wouldn't satisfy. You know, it's kind of like when you go out and you run around a little bit and you get a drink of water, right? But it's not cold, it's warm. Yeah, it does the job, but it just doesn't, it's not the best. You like it nice and cold, right? Well, see, that was their problem. They were trying to satisfy themselves, but they couldn't. And the thing is that we all try to satisfy ourselves with many false gods, and sometimes, maybe a lot of times, we don't see it as such. I mean, we look to our accomplishments, we look to our wealth, we look to our sports, our entertainment to find significance, instead of finding significance in the one who gave us significance. So God, He brings a charge against the people. He's saying, you have rejected His water for your broken cisterns. And so here's the thing, what I want us to do here for a couple of minutes. I want us to think, okay, what does it look like to drink from a broken cistern, all right? So here's the first thing is this, all right? And here's what I want you to think in terms of your own life, is that digging a hole is exhausting work. Now, they didn't have these big, I don't know the fancy names for them, but these front end loaders and stuff like that, right, to dig their holes. They had to go out there and break it up with picks and shovel it out. I mean, this was hard work. And it broke their backs, and it wasn't easy. Judah, as a nation, had dug these holes for themselves. They were trying to find satisfaction in places other than God. And here's the thing. When you do that, you get really tired after a while. You know, I can imagine these people digging these cisterns and how tired they would get. Are you digging your own cistern? Are you getting tired? I know I've gotten tired when I've dug them myself before. You know, King Solomon, he kind of described it like this in Ecclesiastes. He said, here's what it's like, you know, to try to find satisfaction in this world instead of in God. He says this. He said, it's like this. It's like chasing after the wind. I mean, that's the way they felt, you know, okay, here's a cistern, now another one, now another one. It's a chasing after the wind. And it gets really tired to do this. You know what? Here I got a little bit of a homework assignment for you this week. Here's what I want you to do. I want to challenge all of us after church today to walk out into the church parking lot, and I think there's a little bit of a breeze. I want to see everybody out there chasing after the wind. All right? Okay, that's your assignment today. I've got this really weird picture in my head of and people driving by wondering what in the world happened at their church today. The juice in the communion must have been a little strong today. Yeah. But I'm going to save you the work, though. I'm not going to ask you to do that. But I just do want you to know, you do that for a while, you're going to get tired. And it's going to get pretty frustrating because I just want you to know you're not going to be able to catch it. See, but that's what we're often trying to do, is we're chasing after the things that are meaningless. We're digging the cisterns. We're digging the cisterns that won't last, the cisterns that don't satisfy. And so the question is, what are the holes that you're digging in your life? Are you getting tired? I want you to know you don't have to dig them anymore. You don't have to do it anymore. But there's something else, though, that you need to know about drinking from a cistern instead of God's living water, and it's this, is that there's a bitter aftertaste. There's a bitter aftertaste when you do this. I mean, the water, like I mentioned to you, the water in a cistern is really stagnant. And so when you start getting way down to the bottom of the cistern, you know, when maybe it's coming to the end of the dry season, you're almost out of water, and it gets down really low, it gets pretty mucky and pretty nasty. But hey, you got to drink, right? You got to have something to drink. And so unfortunately, the people would drink this stuff. Sometimes it'd be all slimy and nasty. Yeah, not very yummy. But you know what? Sometimes when we build our own cisterns, when we follow after these false gods in our life, sometimes when we just need something to satisfy us, that's what we do. We'll scrape the bottom, instead of the bucket, we scrape the bottom of the cistern, right? And when we do that, it leaves a really bad aftertaste. You know, Jeremiah talks about this in Jeremiah 2:9. He says, God says that your wickedness will bring its own punishment, right? If I were to summarize this verse, your wickedness will bring your own punishment, its own consequence. How many times have you done something that you thought would fulfill you, that you thought would quench that thirst that you need in your life, only to later regret it? Has that ever happened to you? To follow after that false god and think, hey, this will make me happy. This will make things good in my life, only to realize, you know what, it really doesn't. And it's bitter. And you know what Jeremiah is told by God? He says this whole thing's terrible to watch when you see people doing this. If you remember back there in verses 9 through 13, he says, look down and shudder at the sight of this, that here are my children that I have provided this water for, and they've rejected it, and instead they are drinking from these cisterns. Here, let me contextualize this just a little bit for you. Maybe you're having difficulty, because I would imagine hardly any of us in here are drinking from cisterns, okay? But let me contextualize this a little bit. Let's pull up a picture here. Let's say that you were, oh yes, Texas Roadhouse. I know that lunch is coming up. This is probably not a good thing to talk about right now, okay? But let's say that you had your son or your daughter, or maybe someone else that you know that's never went there before. You're thinking, you know what? I'm going to treat them, and I'm going to take them to a really good restaurant. Maybe it's somewhere here in town, right? All right, one of the restaurants in town. I don't care, but where it's at. But you think, I'm going to really treat them. And so I'm going to take them, and I'm going to spoil them a little bit. And so you take them there, and they've never been there before, and they've never had anything like a steak. So you order them a steak, and you're really, really excited about it for them, right? Because they've never had it before. And so the meal is brought, and so we have this, we'll throw up this picture. We have this nice, sizzling steak, all right, that comes to the table, okay? And so it's put there in front of whoever it is that you've brought with you, and you can't help but smile because you're thinking, oh yeah, they're about to experience this amazing food that they've never had before. They're just going to love this. And so it's put down in front of, let's just say it's your child, and they look at the food and they push the plate back. And what do? They reach into their pocket and they pull out of their pocket a piece of these things. Yeah, beef jerky, okay? And the beef jerky's got like a little bit of lint on it, because it was in their pocket, And so, and I don't know, maybe it's been in there for a while. Maybe there's a little bit of mold on it, right? It's not looking the most tasty. And so what does he do? He just kind of brushes it off, cleans it off a little, and then he puts it right in his mouth and he eats it. Yeah. They could have the steak and that's what they want. What is that all about? How would you feel if you were a parent that you did that for your child? Well, I'd be annoyed. I just spent all this money for this steak. It'd be frustrating. Make you a little upset. You've bought this. You provided this gift for your child and they've rejected it. You'd be frustrated. You'd be saddened because you wanted them to experience something really, really good, but they don't. They just want to eat that nasty beef jerky. You know what? This is the image that I think we get with our lives. God provides for us His very best in Jesus Christ. He provides for us His peace, His joy, and His strength. But what do? We say, no, I'll have my beef jerky. And our Father's horrified, as it said there in that passage. You know what? Some of you parents here today, you're probably maybe thinking of a child. Maybe you have a child who is trying to dig their own cistern. They're trying to find water from the world, and what have they done? They have rejected God and His Word. And it's horrifying, isn't it? I mean, think of Manasseh. Remember, Hezekiah was a good king. Hezekiah, I'm sure, taught, trained, loved Manasseh to love the Lord. Could you imagine the feeling Hezekiah had when he might, and I'd have to go back and look, but I don't know if Hezekiah saw Manasseh going down the right track, but maybe he had some ideas that he would. Could you imagine the horror that he had in his mind when he saw this? You know, my heart is breaking for my generation. My heart is breaking for our millennial generation because so many of our kids are building and digging their own cisterns. The American Religious Identification Survey came out a couple years ago, and they found out that those who claim no faith has almost doubled from 8% in 1990 to 15%. The largest demographic of the group who claim no faith are ages 18 to 29 years old. 73% of those who claim no faith grew up in religious homes. 66% are described in the study as deconverts. George Barna, who does a lot of research for churches, estimates that 80% of those reared in the church will be disengaged from their faith by the time that they're 29 years old. 80%. You know, and when you hear those numbers, it's heartbreaking because they're digging their own cisterns. They're not taking up what God has for them. And I mean, what God has for them, it's right there, right? It's right there for them, the living water. But what do they keep doing? They keep digging, and they keep insisting on the cisterns of this world. You know, I know some of you parents, I talk with some of you, and you talk about this to me about your kids, and you're struggling here. Or maybe there's someone in your family, maybe it's a friend or a sibling or another family member, and you're hurting because you see them digging a cistern that will never give them what they truly need. It was interesting as I was looking at this sermon today, I ran across this letter that I want to read to you, and it's a letter that was written by a mother to her son who has left the faith, and here's what she says. She says, "I remember a boy who was so eager to call me mama and gave me spontaneous hugs and kisses. You loved to eat any and all of my food and made me feel like I was the best cook in the world. I remember your stubbornness and hoped that you would use it to change your world, but instead, your stubbornness has changed you. And we miss you, the real you, the one who is strong for the weak and makes everyone else feel safe. I can't help but wonder if I'm somehow to blame for the change of direction you've made of late. Was I too strict? Was I not strict enough? Did I show you the loving grace that is Jesus? Was I just too much of a hypocrite? And then I start to figure out what I would do differently if I had the chance. Would I affirm you more and correct you less? Would I discipline you and guide you more gently? I realize I'm trying to rewrite the past, and that's something that can never be done no matter how hard I try. And I remember that I am to forget those things which are behind and strain toward what is ahead, but next I start to worry. Next, I start to worry about the now and where you are and what you're doing. And I stare at the glow of the digital alarm clock in my room and wonder who you're with at 1:30 in the morning and why you're not answering your phone or your texts. But then she writes, "Here the Comforter draws me near and whispers that I'm not to be anxious for anything. You see, my dear son, you don't belong to me. You never have. Your mom and your dad, we gave you back to God, and I believe that He has a plan for your future and that He will finish what He started in you. And so with this letter, I write to you that you may never see. I pray that you know one thing. It's very important. I pray that you know that my arms are wide open for your return. Anytime you're ready, no matter what you've done, we'll face it together. because His arms are ready too, you know. He awaits your return. He will be dancing and spinning and celebrating with the best of them. He misses you more than I do. He paid a great price to know you. And every day that you're away seems like an eternity. So make haste, my son. We're waiting. Daddy, Jesus, and I. We are fattening the calf and preparing the party. We are standing in the yard, shielding our eyes from the sun, hoping to catch a glimpse of you coming over the horizon. The day cannot come soon enough. Arms always open, Mama. Can't you just feel her heart in that for her son? And we've talked about Jeremiah today, and with Jeremiah, I can just picture Jeremiah had tears running from his eyes, and he's expressing the heart of God to the people. He's telling them, he's saying, please just come home. Just turn back. Just repent of what you've done. Have nothing to do with those cisterns. Find what you're looking for in me, in God alone. Over and over again in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, we see again and again people who are turning from God to idols. But here's the thing. Remember, they're trying to drink the water that never satisfies. And then finally in the New Testament, Jesus comes on the scene. And what does He do? He says, you know what? You've been drinking from this putrid cistern water. You know what? I am the living water. That's what Jesus says. I am the living water. He says, I am the source. I am what you need. I am the spring. You don't have to drink from a cistern anymore. You don't have to. In John chapter 4, He introduces Himself to a woman. One of the coolest stories in the New Testament. He goes up to a woman. This woman, she's been married 5 times. She was living with a person outside of marriage. She had dug these 6 cisterns in her life. She was trying to find satisfaction. And every time she was coming up short, every time a leak was springing up. And so she thought, maybe this guy, maybe this time, this guy, maybe this is the cistern. This is where I'll find my thirst quenched. And then she runs into Jesus. And in John chapter 4, verse 13, I'm paraphrasing this a little bit, but here's what happens. He says that anyone who drinks this water, the water of the world He's referring to, will soon become thirsty again. But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again, because it becomes a fresh, bubbling spring, giving them eternal life. That is what we have available to us. We have the living water. And that's what Jesus says, I'm it. I'm the living water. I'm right here. My arms are wide open for you. And so today, maybe you've been spending your life digging a lot of cisterns. Maybe you're getting a little tired. Maybe you're worn out. And so today, Jesus stands before you and He says, my arms are open for you. Will you come? Here in the next few minutes, we're going to sing a song of invitation. And this is your opportunity to accept the living water in your life. The Messiah, the Savior, the King. To accept Him into your life. To let Him radically change and alter your direction. And I don't want this opportunity for you today to be another one where maybe you start digging, you start accepting Jesus, but then you go back to the old cistern. Today's an opportunity for you to finally find that person who will quench your thirst. So as we sing this song of invitation, we want to give you that chance. If you want to make that decision today, we're going to do something just slightly different, okay? I'm going to be over here actually on the side. We're going to start doing our invitation. If you need to make a choice, a decision today, if you need to pray, if you want to become a part of our church family through membership, whatever it is, I will be over there off to the side, and I'd be glad to pray with you over here in our prayer corner or just to talk with you. And maybe you want to pray after service today. I know right now we have our pictures being taken in our prayer room, but we will have somebody downstairs there outside the door who can take you into one of our classrooms or something and just pray with you. And maybe you've already accepted Christ. I think this message today in a lot of ways is more directed toward those who have accepted Christ, but maybe they've gone a little wayward. They've gone a different direction. You know what Jesus is saying to you? My arms are open wide for you. Come back to me. Will you make that choice today? Why don't we stand as we sing this song?